You think you know David's story? Prepare to have your assumptions shattered. 2 Samuel isn't the sanitized version we often hear. It's where heroes stumble and fall, revealing their all-too-human flaws. It's a chronicle of how God's chosen king descends into the depths of adultery and murder, and how a kingdom built on divine promise teeters on the brink of collapse due to human failings. Forget the Sunday school narratives. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of power, passion, and the weight of prophecy. Witness a king's dramatic transformation, from joyfully dancing before God to concealing himself within the protective walls of his palace. See a family torn apart by the destructive forces of lust, revenge, and the ravages of civil war. Yet, amidst the turmoil, witness the moment when God makes a promise that will reverberate through the millennia, forever altering the course of human history. 2 Samuel lays bare the most brutal family conflicts, the most scandalous political maneuverings, and the most pivotal prophetic moment in the entire Old Testament. This book isn't merely a retelling of David's life. It exposes why the Bible desperately needed Jesus Christ. Every earthly crown is destined to fall. Every kingdom, no matter how mighty, will crumble until the arrival of the true king. So, buckle up and prepare for a turbulent ride. You're about to uncover why 2 Samuel stands as one of the Bible's most essential and explosive books. David was stationed in Ziklag when a figure dashed toward him, bearing grim tidings. The man, breathless and distraught, threw himself to the ground, bowing deeply before David. His clothes were ripped, and his head was covered in dust, signs of profound grief and defeat. This Amalekite announced that he had escaped from the battlefield where Israel had suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Philistines. And the news kept plummeting. Both Saul and Jonathan, David's complex mentor and cherished friend, were dead, slain in battle. But then the messenger made a fatal error, an embellishment that would seal his doom. He boasted that he had found Saul wounded and near death, and that Saul, in his agony, had begged him to deliver the final blow. The man even presented Saul's crown and bracelet as proof of his claim, trophies he believed would earn him favor. What he envisioned as a pathway to reward would become his death warrant. David's response stunned everyone present. Far from celebrating the demise of his rival, he tore his clothes and wept openly. His men followed suit, overcome with mourning and fasting until evening. Then, David turned to the messenger, his voice heavy with grief and righteous anger, and posed a simple question that sealed the man's fate. In chapter 1, verse 14, David asked, "How is it you were not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Without hesitation, David commanded one of his men to strike down the Amalekite. "Your blood be on your own head," he declared in verse 16. "Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" In verse 19, David poured out his grief in a lament. "A gazelle lies slain on your heights, Israel, how the mighty have fallen." He continued his eulogy in verse 23. "Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions." After the period of mourning concluded, David faced a crucial decision. Where should he go next? He didn't rely on his own judgment, but instead sought divine guidance. In chapter 2, verse 1, we read that David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" The Lord responded, "Go up." David then asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. Without delay, David obeyed, taking his 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, and all his men with their families, to Hebron. The move proved to be wise. The men of Judah came to him and anointed him king over their tribe. This marked David's first official coronation, even though he had been secretly anointed by Samuel years prior. David's initial act as king spoke volumes about his character. He learned that the men of Jabesh-Gilead had risked their lives to bury Saul's body, which the Philistines had desecrated. So he sent messengers to express his gratitude. In verse 5, David instructed them to say, "May you be blessed by the Lord for showing this kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him. He even extended an invitation for them to join his kingdom, adding in verse 7, "Now then be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." But while David was solidifying his support in the south, trouble was brewing in the north. Abner, who had served as Saul's army commander, refused to acknowledge David as king. He took Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, across the Jordan River to Mahanaim. There, in verse 9, Abner proclaimed him king over Gilead, Ashuri, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all of Israel. The kingdom was now fractured, split in two. David reigned in Hebron over Judah for 7.5 years, while Ishbosheth ruled from Mahanaim over the other tribes for 2 years. The stage was set for a devastating civil war. The simmering tensions between the two kingdoms erupted into open conflict at a place called Gibeon. Abner led Ishbosheth's men to the pool there, while Joab brought David's forces to the same location. The two armies faced each other across the pool, a tense standoff reminiscent of wild animals poised to strike. Abner, seeking to avoid a full-scale battle, called out across the water with what appeared to be a reasonable proposition. In verse 14, he suggested to Joab, "Let's have some of the young men get up and fight hand-to-hand in front of us." Joab, never one to back down from a challenge, agreed, saying simply, "All right, let them do it." What ensued was both spectacular and horrifying. 12 young men from each side stepped forward for single combat. But instead of a fair fight, verse 16 reveals a shocking twist. Then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. All 24 warriors died in the same moment. This bizarre and gruesome scene ignited a larger battle. The fighting spread beyond the champions to engulf both armies, and David's men proved to be the stronger force. They pursued Abner's forces relentlessly across the countryside. But one young man made a decision that would haunt them all for years to come. Asahel, Joab's younger brother, was renowned for his incredible speed. Verse 18 describes him as being as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. When he saw Abner retreating, he impulsively decided to chase the veteran commander personally. Abner, recognizing the danger, attempted to dissuade him, calling back in verse 22, "Turn aside from pursuing me. Why should I strike you down? Then how could I face your brother Joab?" But Asahel wouldn't heed the warning. He continued his pursuit of Abner, determined to bring down the famous warrior. Finally, Abner was left with no other choice. He spun around and drove the butt of his spear through Asahel's stomach. The young man died instantly. When the other soldiers reached the spot where Asahel had fallen, they stopped in shock. The sight of the dead hero lying in his own blood brought the chase to an abrupt halt. By evening, Abner had escaped to safety, but the damage was irreparable. A blood debt now existed between the families, a debt that would inevitably demand payment in the future. The civil war dragged on for years, but the tide was undeniably turning. Chapter 3, verse 1, succinctly summarizes the situation. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. David's growing strength was reflected in his expanding family. During his time in Hebron, 6 sons were born to him by different wives. His firstborn was Amnon, whose mother was Ahinoam. Then came Kilib by Abigail, Absalom by Maacah, Adonijah by Haggith, Shephatiah by Abital, and Ithream by Eglah. Each new son represented David's increasing power and burgeoning political alliances. Meanwhile, Saul's kingdom was crumbling from within. The breaking point occurred when Ishbosheth leveled a serious accusation against Abner. In verse 7, Ishbosheth challenged Abner. "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" This wasn't simply a personal matter. Claiming a deceased king's concubine was tantamount to claiming his throne, a blatant act of treason. Abner exploded with rage. He couldn't believe that after all his loyal service, Ishbosheth would accuse him of such a betrayal. In verse 8, Abner retorted, "Am I a dog's head? On Judah's side? This very day I am loyal to the house of Saul your father, to his family and friends. I haven't handed you over to David. Yet now you accuse me of an offense involving this woman." The enraged general then made a declaration that would irrevocably alter the course of events. In verse 9, Abner swore an oath. "May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath." He was switching sides, and he meant business. Abner immediately dispatched messengers to David with a simple question, laden with implications. Whose land is it? The meaning was clear. He was prepared to hand over all of Israel to David. But David had one condition before he would engage in negotiations. In verse 13, David stated, "I will not see your face unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Michal had been David's first wife, but Saul had given her to another man during their period of conflict. Abner compelled Ishbosheth to take Michal away from her current husband, Paltiel. The scene was heartbreaking. Verse 16 describes how Paltiel went with her, weeping behind her all the way to Bahurim. But political expediency demanded this sacrifice. With Michal delivered, Abner began working diligently to unite the kingdom under David's rule. He met with the elders of Israel and reminded them in verse 17, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king." He also conferred privately with the leaders of Benjamin, Saul's own tribe, to secure their support. Everyone ultimately agreed to support David. When Abner arrived in Hebron to finalize the peace agreement, David received him with royal honors. They shared a celebratory feast, and Abner pledged to rally all of Israel behind David's throne. In verse 21, Abner assured David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." David, believing that the civil war was finally drawing to a close, sent him away in peace. But Joab was returning from a successful raid, and his men brought news that set his blood boiling. They informed him that Abner had been in the city, had dined at the king's table, and had departed unharmed. Joab was incredulous. He stormed into David's presence and, in verse 24, demanded, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone." Joab remained convinced that Abner was still their enemy and could not be trusted. In verse 25, he insisted, "You know Abner son of Ner, he came to deceive you and observe your movements and find out everything you are doing." Without informing David of his intentions, Joab dispatched messengers to summon Abner back to Hebron. They intercepted the general at the well of Sirah and conveyed the message that David needed to see him urgently. Abner, placing his trust in the recently established peace treaty, returned immediately. As Abner reached the gate of Hebron, Joab approached him with a seemingly friendly greeting and requested a private audience. They stepped aside into the gateway, away from prying eyes. Then, in a sudden and treacherous act, verse 27 recounts, Joab stabbed him in the stomach and he died. The murder was swift and brutal, driven by a desire for revenge for Asahel's death and a deep-seated fear that Abner would supplant Joab as David's military commander. David's response to the news was immediate and decisive. He publicly proclaimed his innocence, declaring in verse 28, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner son of Ner." He then placed a curse on Joab's family, praying that they would be perpetually afflicted with disease, disability, and violent death. David commanded everyone in the city to mourn for Abner. He tore his own clothes, donned sackcloth, and walked in the funeral procession as a visible display of grief. At the burial, David sang another lament, asking in verse 33, "Should Abner have died as the lawless die?" The king's genuine sorrow convinced everyone that he had no involvement in the murder. The assassination of Abner effectively shattered any remaining vestiges of strength within Saul's kingdom. Chapter 4, verse 1, notes, "When Ishbosheth son of Saul heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost courage, and all Israel became alarmed. Without his strong and capable general, the weak king was utterly helpless. Two men saw an opportunity in this chaos. Rechab and Baanah were brothers who commanded raiding parties for Ishbosheth. They hailed from Beeroth, a town that belonged to Benjamin, which technically made them loyal to Saul's family. But loyalty held little sway when weighed against the potential for personal gain. The brothers made their move during the heat of the day when most people were resting. In verse 5 we read that, "They went to the house of Ishbosheth while he was taking his afternoon rest. They feigned a need to retrieve wheat from the house, which provided them with a pretext to enter. Once they located Ishbosheth sleeping in his bedroom, they struck with ruthless efficiency." Verse 6 simply states, "They went into the inner part of the house as if to get some wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. After assassinating the sleeping king, they severed his head and fled under the cover of darkness." The brothers traveled throughout the night to reach Hebron, convinced that they were bringing David precisely what he desired. In verse 8, they presented the head to David and triumphantly announced, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth son of Saul, your enemy who tried to kill you. This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." But David's response stunned them completely. Just as he had executed the Amalekite who falsely claimed to have killed Saul, David was filled with righteous fury towards these murderers. In verse 9, he declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, when someone told me, 'Saul is dead,' and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag." David continued his condemnation in verse 11. "How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed? Should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" Without hesitation, David ordered his men to execute both brothers. They severed their hands and feet and hung their bodies by the pool in Hebron as a gruesome warning to anyone who believed that murder would earn David's favor. But David treated Ishbosheth's head with respect. Verse 12 tells us, "They took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb at Hebron." Even in death, David displayed honor towards Saul's family. With both Abner and Ishbosheth dead, the northern tribes had no choice but to acknowledge reality. All the leaders of Israel traveled to David in Hebron to make him their king. Their reasons were both practical and deeply personal, as they explained in chapter 5, verse 1. "We are your own flesh and blood." They then reminded David of his past leadership, saying in verse 2, "In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" They recognized that David had been their true leader all along, even when Saul wore the crown. The ceremony was formal and binding. Verse 3 records, "All the elders of Israel came to King David at Hebron, and the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel." This marked David's second anointing, first by his own tribe, and now by the entire nation. David was 30 years old when he became king over all of Israel, and he would reign for a total of 40 years, 7.5 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. But first, he needed a capital city that belonged to neither the northern nor the southern tribes, a neutral ground where he could unite the entire nation. Jerusalem was perfect for David's needs. The Jebusites had occupied this mountain fortress for centuries, and it sat strategically on the border between Judah and Benjamin. If David could conquer it, he would have a neutral capital that wouldn't favor any particular tribe. The Jebusites were supremely confident in their defenses. As David's army approached, they taunted him from the walls. In verse 6 they shouted, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and lame can ward you off." They were so certain of their strength that they boasted that even disabled individuals could defend the city against David's mighty warriors. But David was determined to take Jerusalem. He offered a special incentive, stating in verse 8, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind, who are David's enemies." The precise details of the attack remain unclear, but somehow David's men discovered a way to breach the supposedly impregnable city. Once Jerusalem had fallen, David made it his home. Verse 9 states, "David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David." He immediately initiated building projects to strengthen and beautify his new capital. King Hiram of Tyre sent cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons to construct a palace for David. Recognizing David's ascendant power, David's success became apparent to everyone. Verse 12 elucidates the reason. David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now that David had a suitable capital, he resolved to bring the most sacred object in Israel to Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant. This wooden chest contained the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments and symbolized God's very presence among his people. For years, it had been relegated to a private home in Kiriath Jearim, nearly forgotten during the turbulent reign of Saul. David assembled 30,000 chosen men of Israel for this momentous mission. This wasn't merely a matter of moving furniture. This was bringing God himself to reside in the capital city. The celebration commenced immediately as they loaded the ark onto a new cart pulled by oxen. But David committed a critical error. He followed the example of the Philistines from years earlier, rather than adhering to God's specific instructions. The law of Moses stipulated that only Levites were authorized to carry the ark, using special poles and never touching it directly. Instead, David placed it on a cart driven by Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab. The procession was magnificent. Verse 5 describes how David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, cymbals, and sistrums. The exuberant music and dancing conveyed everyone's joy at bringing God's presence to their capital. But as they reached the threshing floor of Nacon, disaster struck. The oxen stumbled, and the ark began to tip precariously. Uzzah instinctively reached out to steady it, and the moment his hand made contact with the sacred chest, he collapsed, dead. Verse 7 explains. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. David's jubilant celebration transformed into shock and fear. He became angry at what had occurred and fearful of continuing. In verse 9, David questioned, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" Instead of transporting it to Jerusalem, he left the ark at the nearby home of Obed-Edom the Gittite. For 3 months, the ark remained in Obed-Edom's house, and God blessed everything that the man owned. When David learned of these blessings, he realized that it was indeed safe to bring the ark to Jerusalem, provided that he followed the proper protocols. David then organized a second procession, but this time, he adhered meticulously to God's commands. Every 6 steps, they paused to offer sacrifices. David donned a linen ephod, like a priest, and danced with all his might before the arkansas. The celebration was even grander than before, with shouts and trumpet blasts echoing throughout the hills. But upon returning home, David was confronted with criticism from an unexpected source. Michal, his wife and Saul's daughter, watched from her window as the procession entered Jerusalem. She was disgusted by what she observed. In verse 16 we read that she despised him in her heart for dancing so wildly. When David arrived home, Michal confronted him sarcastically. In verse 20, she said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half-naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." She felt that David had acted beneath his royal dignity. David's response revealed the depth of his devotion to God. In verse 21, he retorted, "It was before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord." He was unconcerned about what others thought of his worship, and instead placed his sole focus on the glory of God. The chapter concludes on a somber note with the mention of Michal. Verse 23 laconically states that Michal, daughter of Saul, remained childless until her death. The ark, however, had finally found its permanent resting place in Jerusalem, housed within a tent meticulously prepared by David. The kingdom was united, its capital firmly established, and, most importantly, God's presence resided among his people. David's journey from a fugitive to the king of all Israel was complete. Once David had settled comfortably into his magnificent cedar palace, a persistent thought began to gnaw at him. Day after day, he luxuriated in opulence while the Ark of God, the very symbol of God's presence, remained sheltered in a humble tent. It struck him as deeply unjust that the king should dwell in a far grander house than the Lord himself. David, burdened by this realization, shared his concern with Nathan the prophet, articulating his unease in chapter 7, verse 2. Here I am living in a house of cedar, while the Ark of God remains in a tent. Nathan's initial response seemed encouraging, offering immediate validation. In verse 3, the prophet reassured David, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." However, that very night, God delivered a drastically different message to Nathan, a revelation that would reshape David's ambitions. The Lord had a surprising pronouncement to make regarding David's grand plan to construct a temple. God began by reminding David of his humble origins, recounting his remarkable journey in verse 8. "I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel." God reminded David that he had been a constant companion throughout every battle, relentlessly cutting down all his enemies. And then came the unexpected reversal. Instead of David constructing a house for God, God himself would build a house for David. But this would not be a physical structure of wood and stone. In verse 11, God promised, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you." This house, God clarified, would be a dynasty, a lineage that would endure for all eternity. God elaborated on his divine plan in verse 12. "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom." This son, God revealed, would be the one destined to build the temple, not David. In verse 13, God emphatically stated, "He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." The promise transcended the fate of a single son. God was forging a covenant with David's entire family line, a sacred and unbreakable bond. In verse 16, the Lord declared, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." This was not merely about Solomon, nor even solely about Israel's earthly kings. God was pledging something far more profound, a promise that would extend far into the distant future. David's response to God's awe-inspiring promise revealed his true character. He didn't erupt in celebratory boasting about his family's ascent to an eternal dynasty. Instead, he humbly went and sat before the Ark of the Lord, utterly overwhelmed by God's boundless grace. His prayer began with a profound sense of wonder and humility. In verse 18, David questioned, "Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far?" He confessed his inability to comprehend why God had singled him out from all the people of Israel. David reflected on his humble beginnings as a simple shepherd boy and marveled at the extraordinary distance God had carried him. But David understood that God's promise extended far beyond the boundaries of his own mortal life. In verse 19 he acknowledged, "And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this is a charter for all mankind, sovereign Lord." David grasped that this promise would have far-reaching implications, impacting not only Israel but all nations of the world. He gracefully accepted that he would not be the one to build the temple, and instead focused his heart on praising God for his unfailing faithfulness. In verse 20, David confessed, "What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord." He felt no need to articulate his inner thoughts to God, for God already possessed complete and intimate knowledge of his being. The king then extolled God's unparalleled uniqueness among all the gods of the nations. In verse 22, David declared, "How great you are, sovereign Lord! There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears." He recalled how God had delivered Israel from the oppressive clutches of Egypt, transforming them into his chosen people. David's prayer culminated in unwavering confidence in God's promises. In verse 25, he pleaded, "And now, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised." David held an unshakable belief that God would remain true to his word. He concluded his prayer by seeking God's blessing in verse 29. "Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. For you, sovereign Lord, have spoken, and with your blessing the house of your servant will be blessed forever." With God's promise of an eternal kingdom resonating in his heart, David embarked on a series of military campaigns aimed at establishing Israel as the dominant power in the region. His first target was Israel's long-standing nemesis, the Philistines. Chapter 8 opens with the declaration that David decisively defeated the Philistines and subdued them, seizing Metheg-Ammah from Philistine control. This victory held particular significance, as the Philistines had terrorized Israel for generations. Now, instead of instilling fear, they were forced to pay tribute to David. Next, David directed his attention towards Moab, a nation descended from Lot, residing east of the Dead Sea. The campaign was brutal and decisive. Verse 2 recounts that David also conquered the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. The surviving Moabites were subjugated, becoming David's subjects and providing him with tribute. David's most significant victory came against Hadadezer, king of Zobah, who held sway over territory in modern-day Syria. When Hadadezer attempted to reassert his dominion along the Euphrates River, David struck him down. Verse 4 meticulously records the massive scale of David's victory. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Arameans of Damascus intervened to assist Hadadezer, David soundly defeated them as well. Verse 6 reports that David established garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subservient to him, dutifully paying tribute. David was constructing an empire that stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River. The wealth amassed from these conquests was staggering. David seized gold shields from Hadadezer's officers and vast quantities of bronze from his cities. Toi, the king of Hamath, upon hearing of David's triumphant victories, dispatched his son Joram with gifts of gold, silver, and bronze articles to congratulate the conqueror and forge a peaceful alliance. David wholeheartedly dedicated all this wealth to the Lord. Verse 11 clarifies that King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued. The temple that Solomon would eventually build would be largely funded by the spoils of David's military victories. The empire now included Edom, which had been defeated in the south. Verse 14 records that David put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. Wherever David ventured, the Lord granted him victory, enabling him to govern this vast empire effectively. David established an efficient and well-organized administration. Joab retained his position as commander of the army, while Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, served as recorder. Zadok and Ahimelech served as priests. Sariah was secretary, and Benaiah commanded David's personal guard. Verse 18 adds that David's sons were priests, showing how the king kept important positions within his family. Amidst his resounding military triumphs, David remembered a promise he had made years earlier. He had sworn an oath of friendship to Jonathan, Saul's son, and he now wondered if any of Jonathan's family had managed to survive the wars and political purges. David inquired of his servants in verse 1, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" His officials located a former servant of Saul's household named Ziba, who possessed valuable information about surviving family members. When Ziba was brought before the king, David posed the same question. Ziba revealed that Jonathan had a son who was still alive. In verse 3, Ziba explained, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." This was Mephibosheth, who had been crippled in a childhood accident when his nurse, in a moment of panic, dropped him while fleeing from the news of Saul and Jonathan's deaths. David immediately ordered Mephibosheth to be brought from Lo-debar, where he had been living in obscurity. When the young man arrived, he prostrated himself before David in terror, fearing that he would be executed as a potential threat to David's throne, a common practice when dynasties changed hands. But David's words completely shattered his expectations. In verse 7, David reassured him, "Don't be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." This was far more than mere mercy. It was honor and wealth beyond Mephibosheth's wildest dreams. Mephibosheth could scarcely believe what he was hearing. In verse 8, he responded, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" He viewed himself as worthless and powerless, completely at David's mercy. But David was unwavering in his commitment to his promise. He summoned Ziba and issued detailed instructions. In verse 9, David commanded, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family." Ziba and his 15 sons and 20 servants would cultivate the land, but all the produce would belong to Mephibosheth. The chapter concludes with a beautiful illustration of covenant loyalty. Verse 11 reveals that Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Despite his physical limitations, Mephibosheth was treated as family. David kept his promise to his deceased friend Jonathan by caring for Jonathan's son as if he were his own child. David's desire to extend kindness extended beyond Israel's borders to neighboring nations. When Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, passed away, David resolved to send a delegation to express sympathy to the new king, Hanan. Chapter 10, verse 2, elucidates David's reasoning. "I will show kindness to Hanan, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me." David carefully selected several of his officials to serve as ambassadors and dispatched them to the Ammonite capital with a message of condolence. This was standard diplomatic protocol. Kings frequently sent representatives to the funeral ceremonies of neighboring rulers to maintain peaceful relations. But Hanan's advisors harbored deep-seated suspicions of David's motives. They convinced the young king that this was not a genuine gesture of sympathy, but rather a thinly veiled spy mission. In verse 3, Hanan's officials warned him, "Do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it?" Hanan foolishly heeded his advisors instead of accepting David's gesture at face value. What he did next was an act of profound insult that irrevocably guaranteed war. Verse 4 meticulously records the humiliation endured by David's envoys. "So Hanan seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away." This was not merely rude behavior. It was a calculated insult designed to shame David and his representatives. In that culture, a man's beard was a symbol of his dignity and maturity. To mutilate someone's beard was akin to declaring him worthless. Exposing their buttocks added a layer of sexual humiliation to the affront. When David learned of the indignity suffered by his ambassadors, he was consumed by fury at the insult, but also deeply compassionate towards his men. He knew they would be too mortified to return to Jerusalem in their compromised condition. In verse 5, David sent word to them, "Stay at Jericho till your beards have grown and then come back." He sought to spare them further embarrassment. The Ammonites, realizing they had made David their implacable enemy, began preparations for war. They hired Syrian mercenaries to bolster their army. 1,000 talents of silver secured the services of 32,000 chariots and charioteers from various Syrian kingdoms. They also forged an alliance with the king of Makkah and 12,000 men from Tob. When David became aware of these military preparations, he understood the gravity of the situation. The Ammonites had transformed a simple diplomatic gesture into a major international conflict. And now they were assembling the largest army Israel had ever faced. Joab arrived with Israel's army only to find himself confronted with a military nightmare. The Ammonites had strategically positioned themselves in front of their city gate, while their Syrian allies spread out in the open field. This meant that Israel would have to fight on two fronts simultaneously, precisely what the enemy intended. But Joab, an experienced and seasoned general, did not succumb to panic under pressure. He made a brilliant tactical decision by dividing his forces. In verse 11, Joab instructed his brother Abishai, "If the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to rescue you." This strategic plan allowed each brother to concentrate his efforts on one enemy while knowing that assistance would be available if needed. Before the battle commenced, Joab delivered a stirring speech to his men, revealing his profound devotion to God and country. In verse 12, he declared, "Be strong, and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight." Joab understood that they were fighting not merely for military victory, but for God's people and God's honor. The battle strategy proved flawlessly effective. When Joab launched his attack on the Syrians, they faltered and fled. Witnessing their allies in retreat, the Ammonites also retreated before Abishai and sought refuge within their city walls. Verse 14 simply states, "When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city." But the war was far from over. Hadadezer, the Syrian king David had previously defeated, resolved to gather all his forces for one final attempt to crush Israel. He assembled Syrian troops from beyond the Euphrates River under the command of Shobach, his army commander. This time, David chose not to send Joab to lead the battle. He assumed personal command of Israel's forces and marched out to confront the Syrians at Helam. The battle was decisive and devastating for Israel's enemies. Verse 18 meticulously records the massive scale of David's victory. "But they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there." The Syrian coalition was utterly destroyed. The defeat was so complete that it effectively ended Syrian resistance to Israel permanently. Verse 19 explains the result. "When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them." David's empire now stretched all the way to the Euphrates River, fulfilling the promise God had made to Abraham centuries earlier. In the spring, the time when kings typically led their armies to war, David made a decision that would forever alter the course of his life. Instead of accompanying his troops to complete the siege of Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, he remained in Jerusalem. Chapter 11, verse 1, sets the scene. David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David was strolling on the roof of his palace when something caught his eye. A woman was bathing, and she possessed striking beauty. Instead of averting his gaze, David stared intently and then dispatched someone to inquire about her identity. His servant returned with troubling information. In verse 3, the messenger reported, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." David now possessed three crucial pieces of information: her name, her father's identity, and, most importantly, that she was married. Her husband, Uriah, was one of David's own soldiers, currently engaged in the siege David should have been leading. Despite knowing that she was married, David sent messengers to summon Bathsheba to the palace. Verse 4 records what transpired. "Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her." The text notes that she had purified herself from her monthly uncleanness, a detail that would soon become highly significant. After their encounter, Bathsheba returned home. But a few weeks later, she sent David a message that filled him with dread. In verse 5, she informed him simply, "I am pregnant." With just 3 words, David's secret sin transformed into a crisis that threatened to destroy his reputation, his family, and his kingdom. David's initial instinct was to conceal what had occurred. He sent word to Joab at the battlefront, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." David's plan was deceptively simple. If he could persuade Uriah to sleep with his wife, everyone would naturally assume that the baby was Uriah's. When Uriah arrived in Jerusalem, David feigned an interest in a military briefing. He inquired about Joab, the soldiers, and the progress of the war. Then, he dismissed Uriah with instructions to go home to his wife. David even sent a gift to Uriah's house, hoping to foster a romantic atmosphere. But David's plan was thwarted by Uriah's unwavering integrity. Instead of going home to Bathsheba, Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with David's servants. When David learned of this, he summoned Uriah back and questioned him in verse 10. "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's reply revealed his noble character. In verse 11, he explained, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." While his king indulged in palace luxuries, Uriah refused to partake in pleasures that his fellow soldiers were unable to share. Desperate to salvage his plan, David kept Uriah in Jerusalem for another day and plied him with alcohol, hoping that intoxication might weaken his resolve. But even under the influence of alcohol, Uriah remained steadfast in his principles. Verse 13 says that he went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. With his cover-up attempt failing miserably, David chose a path that would haunt him forever. He penned a letter to Joab and entrusted it to Uriah to carry back to the battlefield. The bitter irony was that Uriah was unknowingly carrying his own death warrant. The letter contained David's coldest command. In verse 15, David ordered Joab, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." David was leveraging his position as king to commit murder, and he was implicating his loyal general as an accomplice. Joab dutifully obeyed his king's order. He positioned Uriah in the most perilous spot during an attack on Rabbah's walls. When the enemy retaliated fiercely, Joab pulled his men back, leaving Uriah exposed. Uriah perished in battle along with several other soldiers, precisely as David had planned. When the battle report reached David, Joab included a message designed to prevent the king from becoming enraged about the military losses. But David's response revealed his true priorities. After learning of Uriah's death, verse 25 records David's callous reply. "Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another." When Bathsheba received news of her husband's death, she mourned for him according to custom. But as soon as her mourning period concluded, David sent for her. Verse 27 concludes the chapter with David's apparent success. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the chapter ends with an ominous warning that David's sin had not gone unnoticed. The final sentence declares, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord." David may have believed that his secret was safe, but God sees everything. The Lord dispatched Nathan the prophet to confront the king. But Nathan, with his characteristic wisdom, approached the sensitive subject with utmost care. Instead of directly accusing David, he crafted a compelling story designed to lead the king to condemn himself. In chapter 12, verse 1, Nathan began his parable. "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had large flocks of sheep and cattle, while the poor man, however, possessed only a single cherished lamb. It was more than just a pet. It was family. That little lamb was like a daughter to him, a constant companion and source of comfort in his humble life. It ate from his very table, sharing in his meager meals. It drank from his cup, quenching its thirst alongside him. And at night, it slept nestled in his arms, finding warmth and security in his embrace. The lamb was, in essence, his most prized possession, a symbol of love and companionship in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving. Nathan continued his story, weaving a tale of stark contrast. In verse 4, a traveler, weary and hungry, arrived at the home of the wealthy man. Hospitality demanded that the rich man provide a meal for his guest. Yet, weighed down by his selfishness, instead of selecting one of his own abundant sheep or cattle to prepare a suitable feast, a truly appalling act occurred. The rich man, disregarding all sense of fairness and compassion, seized the poor man's beloved lamb. He stole the very creature that was cherished and sustained by the less fortunate man. With callous indifference, he butchered the lamb and prepared it for the traveler, callously disregarding the devastating loss he inflicted on the poor man. David's reaction was immediate and explosive. He was consumed by righteous anger at the blatant injustice portrayed in Nathan's story. The king, known for his own sense of justice, was completely blind to the story's parallel to his own actions. In verse 5, David, his voice booming with indignation, declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die." The severity of the crime, the utter lack of empathy, fueled his fury. He continued his condemnation in verse 6, stating emphatically, "He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." The punishment, in David's mind, needed to be commensurate with the cruelty and callousness of the act. Nathan had meticulously crafted the perfect trap, a snare woven with truth and designed to expose David's hypocrisy. With David's own impassioned words condemning the rich man's actions ringing in the air, the prophet unleashed the devastating revelation. In verse 7, Nathan, his gaze unwavering, declared with undeniable authority, "You are the man." The words hung heavy in the air, a hammer blow that shattered David's self-deception. Then, with unwavering courage, Nathan delivered God's message directly to the king's face. God reminded David of the immeasurable blessings bestowed upon him through Nathan's carefully chosen words in verse 8. "I anointed you king over Israel," Nathan declared, echoing God's voice, "and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more." The list of gifts was staggering, a testament to God's incredible generosity. David had been granted power, protection, and prosperity beyond measure. Yet, despite this abundance, he still craved what belonged to another man. Nathan then laid bare David's sins, detailing the depth of his transgression in verse 9. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your wife. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." The charges were stark and undeniable. David had not only committed adultery but had compounded his sin with murder. God saw both the betrayal and the bloodshed, and he held David accountable for both. The judgment was swift and unrelenting. Nathan announced God's punishment in verse 11. "Out of your own household," he proclaimed, "I am going to bring calamity on you before your very eyes. I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight." The prophet foretold a future marked by strife and shame, a consequence directly linked to David's actions. David's secret sin would be repaid with public humiliation, a stark reversal of his attempts to conceal his wrongdoing. However, the immediate consequence would be even more heartbreaking. In verse 14, Nathan delivered the most devastating blow, telling David, "Because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord. The son born to you will die." The innocent child, a symbol of their union, would pay the ultimate price for his father's guilt. David's response was immediate and profound, revealing genuine repentance. In verse 13, he simply confessed, "I have sinned against the Lord." There were no excuses offered, no attempts to rationalize his actions, just an honest and heartfelt acknowledgement of his guilt. Nathan, witnessing the king's contrition, confirmed that David's repentance was accepted. He told the king, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die." While David would be spared the ultimate penalty, he would not escape the consequences of his choices. The judgment began immediately. The baby, a symbol of David's transgression, became gravely ill. David, consumed by guilt and remorse, did everything in his power to save his son's life. He fasted, lay prostrate on the ground all night, and refused to eat, desperately pleading for divine intervention. His officials, witnessing his anguish, were afraid to tell him when the child finally succumbed to his illness on the seventh day, fearing that David, in his grief, might harm himself. But David's reaction surprised everyone. When he realized the child was dead, he rose from the ground, washed, changed his clothes, and went to worship in the house of the Lord. He then returned home and asked for food, accepting the inevitable with a quiet dignity. His servants were baffled by his seemingly paradoxical behavior. When they questioned him about why he was acting normally after the child's death, David explained in verse 23, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." David accepted the finality of death, finding solace in the hope of reunion in the afterlife. David then comforted Bathsheba in her grief, offering her solace and support during her time of sorrow. In time, she became pregnant again. When their second son was born, they named him Solomon. Verse 24 adds that the Lord loved him, a sign that God's judgment was complete and his mercy was returning, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the lingering consequences of David's sin. Meanwhile, the siege of Rabbah was nearing its end. Joab, recognizing the strategic importance of the victory, sent word to David that the city was on the verge of falling and urged the king to come personally to capture it. David, eager to solidify his power and reputation, gathered his forces and went to Rabbah, taking the city and claiming the victory. He seized the royal crown, which weighed a talent of gold, a symbol of power and authority, and made it his own. The conquest was complete, but David's personal battles were just beginning. The repercussions of his sin with Bathsheba would reverberate through his family for years to come, casting a long shadow over his reign. Nathan's prophecy about trouble arising from David's own house began with his oldest son, Amnon. Chapter 13:1 tells us that Amnon fell prey to a consuming lust for Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, another son of David. But this wasn't genuine love. It was a destructive obsession that consumed Amnon completely, twisting his desires into something dark and dangerous. Verse 2 describes how Amnon became so obsessed with his half-sister Tamar that he feigned illness, his mind clouded by his inappropriate desires. She was a virgin, and societal constraints made it seem impossible for him to act upon his forbidden desires. His cousin Jonadab, a cunning and unscrupulous individual, noticed Amnon's distress and devised a wicked plan to exploit his weakness. In verse 5 he told Amnon, "Go to bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat.'" Jonadab's suggestion was a calculated manipulation designed to give Amnon access to Tamar under false pretenses. Amnon, blinded by his lust, followed this evil advice perfectly. When David, concerned for his son's health, came to check on him, Amnon made his request exactly as Jonadab had suggested. David, caring for his son's well-being, immediately sent word to Tamar to help her brother. She came innocently to Amnon's house, unaware of the dark intentions lurking beneath the surface. She began to prepare bread, a simple act of sisterly kindness, while he watched from his bed, his eyes filled with predatory desire. But when Tamar brought the food to him, Amnon abruptly told everyone else to leave, dismissing the servants and creating an atmosphere of isolation and vulnerability. Once they were alone, his true intentions became chillingly clear. In verse 11, he grabbed Tamar, his grip forceful and unwanted, and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." Tamar was horrified, her innocence shattered by his betrayal. She tried desperately to stop him, pleading with him to reconsider his actions. In verse 12, she begged, "No, my brother, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing." She appealed to his sense of morality, reminding him of the societal taboos and the potential consequences of his actions. But Amnon was beyond reason, his lust overwhelming his sense of right and wrong. Verse 14 records the brutal reality of what happened next. But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. The act was a violation of her body and spirit, leaving her traumatized and broken. What happened next revealed the depravity of Amnon's twisted feelings. Verse 15 describes the shocking change in his emotions. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. His lust had transformed into a burning resentment, turning his victim into the object of his rage. He threw her out of his house, callously discarding her as if she were nothing more than a used object, leaving Tamar devastated and alone. When Absalom found his sister crying, he recognized the signs of what had happened. He told her to be quiet, advising her to keep the matter private. But his calm words hid a burning rage that would eventually explode. For 2 long years, Absalom said nothing about what Amnon had done to their sister. Chapter 13:22 explains his carefully calculated strategy. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. Absalom's silence was not acceptance. It was a simmering cauldron of anger, a carefully cultivated plan for revenge. But Absalom's silence didn't mean he had forgotten. He was patiently waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The opportunity for revenge came during sheep shearing season, a time of celebration and feasting. Absalom owned property in Baal-Hazor and decided to throw a lavish party there. He went to David with what seemed like an innocent invitation, masking his true intentions beneath a veneer of filial piety. In verse 23, Absalom said, "Your servant has had shearers come. Will the king and his attendants please join me?" David, sensing the potential for a costly affair, politely declined, knowing that entertaining his entire court would be an expensive undertaking. When Absalom pressed him, David blessed his son but still refused to come, wary of the underlying motives. Then Absalom made what seemed like a reasonable alternative request, further solidifying his facade of innocence. In verse 26 he asked, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." David found this request puzzling, but eventually agreed to send all the king's sons to the celebration, unknowingly sending Amnon into the hands of his executioner. The sheep-shearing festival proceeded normally at first, with plenty of food, wine, and joyous celebration, but Absalom had given his servants secret instructions, setting the stage for his meticulously planned revenge. In verse 28 he told them, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave." Absalom's instructions were clear and unambiguous, authorizing his servants to carry out his murderous plot. When the moment was right, and Amnon was drunk and relaxed, lulled into a false sense of security, Absalom gave the signal. His servants, acting on his command, struck Amnon down and killed him instantly. The other princes, witnessing their brother murdered before their eyes, panicked and fled on their mules, fearing for their own lives. A garbled report reached David before his sons could return home, claiming that all the king's sons were dead, throwing the palace into chaos and despair. David's grief was overwhelming until Jonadab, the same cousin who had orchestrated Amnon's crime, explained that only Amnon was dead, killed in revenge for raping Tamar, revealing the true motive behind the violence. Soon David's surviving sons returned home, confirming the truth and deepening the tragedy. But Absalom had fled immediately to Geshur, his grandfather's kingdom, seeking refuge from David's wrath. He stayed there for 3 years, a fugitive in exile, while David mourned for both his dead son and his exiled one, torn between grief and anger. After 3 years of separation, Joab, ever observant of the king's moods, noticed that David's anger toward Absalom was softening, giving him an idea for a clandestine intervention. Chapter 14, verse 1 tells us that Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom, despite the gravity of his actions. David missed his son, but his royal position made it difficult to simply recall a murderer from exile, creating a political dilemma. Joab, motivated by his loyalty to David and his own political ambitions, decided to help by arranging a clever intervention, using a wise woman from Tekoa as his pawn. He gave her detailed instructions and had her dress in mourning clothes to make her story believable, hoping to manipulate David's emotions. When the woman appeared before David, she told him a heartbreaking story about being a widow whose 2 sons had fought, resulting in one killing the other. Now her family wanted to execute the remaining son for murder, leaving her destitute and alone. She told David in verse 7, "Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed.'" She explained that if her last son died, her family line would be extinct, and she would have no one to care for her in her old age, appealing to David's sense of compassion and his duty to protect the vulnerable. David, moved by her plight and believing her story, promised to protect her son, unknowingly falling into Joab's carefully laid trap. But then the woman sprang her trap, revealing the underlying purpose of her visit. In verse 13 she said, "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son." She was subtly pointing out David's hypocrisy and inconsistency in protecting her fictional son while keeping his own son in exile, forcing him to confront the parallels between the two situations. The woman's argument was brilliant and piercing, reminding David that God himself believes in restoration and second chances, challenging his rigid stance towards Absalom. When David realized that Joab was behind this elaborate intervention, he reluctantly gave in, recognizing the truth in the woman's words. In verse 21 he told Joab, "Very well, I will do it. Go bring back the young man Absalom." But David's reconciliation came with a significant condition, a compromise that reflected his ongoing conflict. Absalom could return to Jerusalem, but was forbidden from seeing his father's face, a symbolic separation that underscored the unresolved issues between them. When Absalom returned to Jerusalem, everyone noticed him immediately because of his spectacular beauty, making him a figure of admiration and envy. Chapter 14:25 explains why, stating that in all Israel there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. His most striking feature was his magnificent hair, which was so thick and beautiful that it weighed 5 pounds when cut annually, further enhancing his image of power and allure. Despite his beauty and success, Absalom was deeply frustrated by his father's coldness, his heart filled with resentment and a desire for recognition. For 2 full years, he lived in Jerusalem without being allowed to see David's face, a form of partial reconciliation that was worse than exile. He was close enough to the palace to feel rejected every day, fueling his anger and his ambition. Finally, Absalom decided to force a meeting with his father through Joab, who had arranged his return, pushing the boundaries of their strained relationship. When Joab ignored his requests twice, Absalom took drastic action, escalating the situation to gain attention. In verse 30, he told his servants, "Look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." This wasn't just property damage. It was a calculated act of aggression, a direct challenge to Joab that he couldn't ignore. The plan worked perfectly. When Joab's barley field went up in flames, he came storming to Absalom's house demanding answers, his anger ignited by the blatant disrespect. Absalom was ready with his carefully rehearsed response, turning the situation to his advantage. In verse 32 he explained, "Look, I sent word to you and said, 'Come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me if I was still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death.'" Absalom's logic was simple but powerful. He deserved either full restoration or execution, not this painful limbo of partial acceptance. Joab recognized the wisdom in his argument and agreed to help arrange the meeting, seeing the potential for political gain. The reunion between father and son was formal but emotional, a carefully staged event that masked the underlying tensions. Verse 33 describes what happened. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom, After 5 years of separation, father and son were finally reunited. But this reconciliation was only surface deep, masking Absalom's true intentions. Once Absalom regained access to his father, he began preparing for something much bigger than family reconciliation, plotting a course toward rebellion. Chapter 15:1 tells us that Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him, creating a spectacle of royal grandeur that was designed to impress the people. This wasn't just a royal display. It was political theater, carefully crafted to make Absalom look like the future king, capturing their attention and their admiration. Every morning, Absalom positioned himself strategically at the gate of Jerusalem, where people came to seek justice from the king, intercepting them before they could reach David's court. When anyone approached with a legal dispute, Absalom would greet them with a friendly and sympathetic demeanor, designed to make people feel heard and valued, creating an impression of accessibility and concern. Absalom's technique was brilliant political manipulation, exploiting the people's desire for justice and their dissatisfaction with the current administration. In verse 3, when someone came with a case, Absalom would say, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you," subtly undermining David's authority and planting seeds of doubt in the people's minds. He was implying that David's government was failing to provide proper justice, while positioning himself as someone who understood their problems and cared about their well-being. Then Absalom would deliver his killer line, solidifying his image as the people's champion. In verse 4, he would say, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice," subtly promising to be the kind of king that Israel needed, accessible, fair, and personally involved in his people's problems. Absalom's false humility was particularly effective when people bowed to him in respect. Verse 5 tells us that instead of accepting formal honor, he would reach out his hand and take hold of them and kiss them, treating everyone like a close friend and fostering a sense of camaraderie. The strategy worked perfectly over 4 years, slowly but surely eroding David's support base and building his own. Verse 6 explains the result. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. After 4 years of careful preparation, Absalom was ready to launch his rebellion, confident that he had secured the loyalty of the people. He went to David, asking permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a religious vow, masking his true intentions beneath a veil of piety. And David, unsuspecting of his son's treachery, gave his blessing, unknowingly setting the stage for his own downfall. But Absalom had already sent secret messengers throughout Israel with instructions to proclaim him king when they heard the trumpet signal, igniting the flames of rebellion across the land. The news hit David like a thunderbolt, shattering his world and plunging him into a crisis. A messenger came running to the palace with devastating information. In verse 13, he reported, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom," confirming David's worst fears. David's own son had successfully stolen the loyalty of the entire nation and was marching on Jerusalem with an army, threatening his throne and his life. David's response was immediate and practical, demonstrating his decisive leadership in the face of adversity. He knew that Jerusalem's walls could become a trap if besieged, endangering the lives of his loyal followers. In verse 14, David told his officials, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." The evacuation began immediately, a frantic scramble to escape the impending doom. David's household, his officials, and his loyal soldiers prepared to leave the capital, leaving behind the familiar comforts of the palace and venturing into the uncertain future. Though he was forced to abandon his palace, he deliberately left behind 10 concubines to care for the royal residence, a symbolic gesture that would later have significant consequences. As the procession moved out, David was encouraged to see his bodyguard remain loyal, including 600 Gittites under the command of Ittai, a foreign commander whose allegiance was unwavering. David, mindful of Ittai's foreign origins and his recent arrival in his service, tried to release him from his obligation, recognizing the potential risks involved in joining a fleeing king. But Ittai's response revealed true loyalty, a testament to his character and his unwavering commitment to David. In verse 21, he declared, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there your servant will be," pledging his unwavering support until the very end. When David reached the Kidron Valley and saw the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, he made a difficult but ultimately faith-filled decision that revealed his deep-seated belief in God's sovereignty. In verse 25, David told Zadok, "Take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again," entrusting his fate to divine providence. David understood that the Ark belonged in Jerusalem, not in exile with a fleeing king, trusting that God would protect his sacred dwelling place. As David climbed the Mount of Olives weeping, overwhelmed by the betrayal and the loss of his kingdom, he received devastating news that his most trusted counselor, Ahithophel, had joined Absalom's rebellion, delivering a crushing blow to his morale. This betrayal hit David harder than his son's revolt. Knowing that Ahithophel's wisdom and counsel would be used against him, he immediately prayed in verse 31, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness," pleading for divine intervention to undermine his enemy's strategy. But God provided help when Hushai the Archite arrived, a loyal friend whom David sent back to Jerusalem as a double agent, tasked with frustrating Ahithophel's advice from within Absalom's court, planting a seed of discord in the heart of the rebellion. As David's procession continued its journey away from Jerusalem, they faced both hostility and unexpected kindness, experiencing the spectrum of human emotions during their darkest hour. When they reached Bahurim, a man named Shimei from Saul's family came out cursing and throwing stones at the king and his supporters, venting his long-held resentment towards David's reign. Chapter 16:7 records Shimei's bitter words, Get out, you murderer, you scoundrel! The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom." Every word was designed to wound David's spirit during his darkest hour, reminding him of his past transgressions and fueling his sense of guilt and despair. Abishai, Joab's brother, was furious at this blatant insult to his king, unable to tolerate the disrespect shown towards David. In verse 9, he asked David, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head," eager to silence the insolent man. But David's response revealed his broken but still faithful heart, his unwavering belief in God's ultimate authority. In verse 10, he told Abishai, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" David was wondering if God himself had sent Shimei to curse him as part of his punishment, accepting the insults as a form of divine retribution. David continued his remarkable response in verse 11, demonstrating his humility and his acceptance of God's will. "My own son, my own flesh and blood, is trying to kill me. How much more, then, this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to." If his own son could betray him, why should David be surprised by a stranger's hatred? Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom was taking control of the city, establishing his authority with disturbing symbolism and consolidating his power. When Hushai arrived and offered to serve the new king, Absalom questioned his loyalty, but Hushai gave a clever answer that satisfied his ego, cleverly maneuvering himself into Absalom's inner circle. Ahithophel then gave shocking counsel about how Absalom should establish his authority, a plan that would forever alter the course of David's life. In verse 21, he told Absalom, "Sleep with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father." This wasn't just political advice. It was a calculated act of defiance, designed to sever all ties between Absalom and David and solidify his claim to the throne. It was also the fulfillment of Nathan's prophecy that David's wives would be given to another in broad daylight, a chilling reminder of the consequences of his sin. A tent was set up on the palace roof, and verse 22 records that Absalom slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel, an act of brazen rebellion and a public declaration of his usurpation of power. The next morning, Ahithophel presented Absalom with a plan that could have ended the rebellion immediately, capitalizing on David's weakened state. In chapter 17:1, he proposed, "Let me choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David." Ahithophel wanted to strike while David was tired, disorganized, and demoralized, overwhelming his forces before they had a chance to regroup. His strategy was brilliant. Attack David personally while his forces were scattered and weak, delivering a swift and decisive blow. The plan impressed everyone who heard it, recognizing its potential for success. But Absalom made a fatal mistake by asking for a second opinion from Hushai, paving the way for his own downfall. When Hushai was called in, he carefully undermined Ahithophel's counsel, sowing seeds of doubt in Absalom's mind and offering an alternative strategy. In verse 8 he warned, "You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs." Instead, Hushai advised Absalom to wait and gather all of Israel. He proposed gathering all of Israel for a massive military campaign, personally led by Absalom, an idea that resonated with Absalom's vanity and ambition. Promised glory, but in reality it meant a significant delay. The pivotal decision is documented in verse 14. Absalom and all the men of Israel declared, "The advice of Hushai the Arite is better than that of Ahithophel." However, the text reveals the true, divinely orchestrated reason behind this decision. The Lord, in his sovereign will, had determined to thwart the astute counsel of Ahithophel, setting Absalom on a path to utter ruin. Ahithophel, a man of keen intellect and political savvy, immediately grasped the implications of his rejected counsel. He knew that Absalom's cause was now irrevocably doomed. Overwhelmed by despair and the certainty of impending disaster, his response was tragically final. Verse 23 recounts that he meticulously arranged his affairs, putting his house in order, before taking his own life by hanging. Meanwhile, across the Jordan River, David was actively reorganizing his forces at Mahanaim. As both armies prepared for the inevitable clash, the battle lines were drawn in the forest of Ephraim. David's seasoned commanders, mindful of his importance to the kingdom, adamantly refused to allow him to personally engage in the fighting. However, David issued a crucial directive, ensuring that his words reached the ears of every soldier. In chapter 18, verse 5, he emphatically ordered, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." The ensuing battle proved to be a catastrophic defeat for Absalom's forces. Verse 7 starkly records the immense casualties, with 20,000 men perishing in the conflict. David's highly trained and experienced soldiers demonstrated their superiority over Absalom's numerically larger but less seasoned army. The very forest itself seemed to turn against Absalom's troops, with many soldiers becoming disoriented, lost, or ensnared within its dense and unforgiving depths. Absalom's end was marked by bitter irony. His magnificent hair, once a symbol of his pride and virility, became the instrument of his downfall. Verse 9 poignantly describes the events. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's hair got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in midair, while the mule he was riding kept on going. When Joab, ever the ruthless military leader, received word that Absalom was suspended helplessly in the tree, he seized the opportunity without hesitation. Taking 3 javelins in hand, he thrust them directly into the heart of the rebellious prince. With their leader dead, Absalom's army disintegrated completely. The handsome prince, who had so audaciously attempted to usurp his father's throne, ultimately met his end in an unmarked grave. News of Absalom's death should have been met with jubilation and widespread celebration, but David's reaction stunned everyone. Chapter 19, verse 1, reveals that Joab received reports of the king weeping and deeply mourning for Absalom. Instead of expressing gratitude to God for granting victory, David was consumed by overwhelming grief for his treacherous son. His anguished weeping echoed through the palace walls as he repeatedly cried out in verse 4, "O my son Absalom! O Absalom, my son, my son!" The man who had relentlessly sought to end his life was the sole focus of David's thoughts and emotions. The anticipated victory celebration transformed into a somber and oppressive atmosphere of mourning. Verse 2 elucidates that for the entire army, the triumph of that day was overshadowed by grief, as the troops overheard the lament. The king is grieving for his son. David's soldiers had risked their lives to protect him, yet now they felt a profound sense of shame and disillusionment in their hard-won success. These valiant warriors, who should have been hailed as heroes, slunk back into the city like defeated men, their spirits crushed by the king's inconsolable sorrow. Verse 3 vividly depicts the scene. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. Joab, a man of action and unwavering pragmatism, could no longer passively witness this disheartening display. He boldly marched directly into David's private chambers, where the king was still immersed in his grief-stricken lamentations. Joab's words, found in verse 5, were harsh but undeniably necessary. Today you have humiliated all your men, who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. Joab continued his scathing rebuke with unvarnished honesty in verse 6. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Then Joab delivered his stark ultimatum. In verse 7 he sternly warned David, Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth till now. David, finally jolted back to reality by Joab's harsh words, realized the grave danger of his actions. His personal grief was threatening to destroy the very kingdom he had dedicated his life to preserving. Slowly, he regained his composure and went to sit in the gateway, where his people could see him and have access to him. Word rapidly spread throughout the city that the king was available and receptive. And verse 8 tells us that all the men came before the king, seeking his leadership and guidance. The arduous process of healing and reconciliation could at long last begin. David's return journey to Jerusalem became a delicate and carefully orchestrated exercise in political forgiveness and wisdom. One of his first encounters was with Shimei, the man who had brazenly cursed him and hurled stones during his desperate escape from Absalom. Now Shimei came running with 1,000 Benjamites to meet David at the Jordan River. He prostrated himself before the king and, in verse 19, earnestly pleaded, May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. Abishai, ever the loyal and zealous warrior, still advocated for Shimei's immediate execution for his earlier acts of defiance and insults. However, David, demonstrating remarkable restraint and political acumen, chose the path of mercy and reconciliation instead. In verse 22, David firmly declared, What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that anyone should be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel? David then swore an oath, assuring Shimei that he would not be put to death. Next came Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who appeared in a deplorable state, having neglected his personal hygiene and appearance throughout David's absence. His feet were unwashed, his beard untrimmed, and his clothes were soiled and dirty. When David inquired as to why he had not accompanied him during the exile, Mephibosheth explained in verse 26, My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me. The truth regarding Ziba's deceitful actions finally came to light. However, David, weary of the ongoing family disputes and intricate web of betrayals, simply sought to bring the matter to a close. In verse 29, he curtly told Mephibosheth, Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land. Mephibosheth's response revealed the true integrity of his heart. He told David that Ziba could have it all, expressing his joy and relief that the king had returned safely. The most poignant encounter occurred with Barzillai, the elderly and benevolent man who had selflessly provided food and essential supplies during David's exile. When David extended an invitation for him to live in Jerusalem and enjoy the comforts of the royal court, Barzillai politely declined. In verse 35, he humbly stated, "How many more years will I live that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers?" Instead, Barzillai sent his son Chimham to serve in the royal court. However, as David's procession drew nearer to Jerusalem, latent tribal tensions began to resurface. The men of Judah had orchestrated David's crossing of the Jordan River, leading the northern tribes to feel marginalized and excluded. In verse 41, the men of Israel lodged a complaint to David. "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan together with all his men?" This seemingly minor dispute would soon escalate into another full-blown crisis, threatening to unravel the fragile peace that had been painstakingly restored. The simmering resentment between Judah and the northern tribes created a golden opportunity for yet another aspiring rebel. A troublemaker named Sheba, the son of Bichri, recognized his chance to exploit the divisions and blew a trumpet to capture everyone's attention. Chapter 20, verse 1, records his provocative rallying cry. "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent, Israel." This rebellious slogan effectively tapped into the long-standing northern resentment against southern dominance. The response was both immediate and devastating. Verse 2 ominously tells us that, "So all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from the Jordan to Jerusalem." The kingdom was fracturing once again, just as David had dared to believe that peace and stability had finally been secured. David acted decisively to prevent this new rebellion from gaining further momentum and strength. He tasked Amasa, his newly appointed army commander, with mobilizing the forces of Judah within 3 days. In verse 4, David ordered, "Summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days, and be here yourself." However, Amasa exceeded the deadline that David had explicitly set. David, recognizing the urgency of the situation, could not afford to wait any longer and turned to Abishai for assistance. In verse 6, David urgently warned, "Now Sheba, son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom did. Take your master's men and pursue him, or he will find fortified cities and escape from us." Abishai, accompanied by Joab's men, the royal bodyguard, and all available fighting men, set out immediately in hot pursuit of Sheba. As they marched out of Jerusalem, they encountered Amasa, who was on his way to join them, at the great rock in Gibeon. What transpired next was an act of shocking brutality. Joab greeted Amasa as if he were a long-lost friend, inquiring about his well-being. As Joab extended his right hand, ostensibly to grasp Amasa's beard in a friendly kiss, verse 10 chillingly records the treachery. Amasa was not on his guard against the dagger in Joab's hand, and Joab plunged it into Amasa's belly, and his intestines spilled out on the ground. Without being stabbed again, Amasa died. Joab had once again ruthlessly eliminated a potential rival for military leadership. One of Joab's men stood over Amasa's lifeless body and shouted to the troops, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." When the soldiers continued to stare in morbid fascination at the corpse instead of marching forward, someone hastily dragged Amasa's body off the road and covered it with a cloth to prevent further delay. Then, all the men continued to follow Joab in relentless pursuit of Sheba. Sheba's rebellion led him northward through all the tribes of Israel, garnering support and followers as he advanced. He ultimately sought refuge in the city of Abel Beth-Maachah, a city renowned for its wisdom and its peaceful nature. Joab arrived with his army and immediately began constructing siege works, intending to breach the city walls and capture the rebel leader. The situation appeared utterly hopeless for the people trapped inside with Sheba. But then, a wise woman from the city, recognizing the impending doom, called out from the wall to get Joab's attention. When he drew near, she inquired in verse 17, "Are you Joab?" When he confirmed his identity, she pleaded, "Listen to what your servant has to say." Joab, intrigued by her request, agreed to hear her out. The woman began by reminding Joab of her city's long-standing reputation for wisdom and peaceful resolution. In verse 18, she stated, "Long ago they used to say, 'Get your answer at Abel,' and that settled it." She was subtly conveying that Abel Beth Makkah was celebrated for its wise counsel and its ability to find peaceful solutions to complex problems. Then, she presented her core argument in verse 19. "We are the peaceful and faithful in Israel. You are trying to destroy a city that is a mother in Israel. Why do you want to swallow up the Lord's inheritance?" She was appealing to Joab's sense of justice and morality, questioning why he would consider destroying innocent people who had committed no crime. Joab's response revealed that he was not interested in senseless destruction or wanton bloodshed. In verse 20, he replied, "Far be it from me. Far be it from me to swallow up or destroy." He clarified his true purpose in verse 21. "That is not the case. A man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Hand over this one man, and I'll withdraw from the city." The woman immediately embraced this reasonable solution. She confidently assured Joab, "His head will be thrown to you from the wall." The wise woman then went to her people and persuaded them that sacrificing one rebellious individual was a far better alternative than watching their entire city be destroyed and its inhabitants slaughtered. The people of Abel Beth Makkah, convinced by her wisdom, executed Sheba and threw his head over the wall to Joab. Verse 22 concludes, "So he sounded the trumpet, and his men dispersed from the city, each returning to his home. And Joab went back to the king in Jerusalem. The rebellion was quelled. The city was spared, and peace was restored through the exercise of wisdom and diplomacy rather than through brute force and warfare." The chapter concludes by listing David's government officials, demonstrating that normal administration had resumed, with Joab once again serving as army commander, despite his continued acts of violence and ruthlessness. During David's reign, Israel was afflicted by a devastating famine that persisted for 3 long years. Crops failed, people suffered from hunger, and the land was parched and barren. David, after a prolonged period of suffering, finally did what he should have done from the very beginning. He sought the Lord's face, earnestly seeking to understand why this terrible disaster had befallen his kingdom. Chapter 21, verse 1, reveals what God disclosed. "It is on account of Saul and his blood-stained house. It is because he put the Gibeonites to death." Years earlier, Saul had flagrantly violated a sacred oath that Joshua had made with the Gibeonites centuries before. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but Israel had solemnly sworn to protect them. Despite this binding covenant, Saul, driven by his misguided zeal for Israel and Judah, had attempted to exterminate them. Now, God was holding the nation accountable for this broken promise. David immediately summoned the surviving Gibeonites to meet with him. He directly inquired of them in verse 3, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement so that you will bless the Lord's inheritance?" The Gibeonites, surprisingly, did not demand monetary compensation or the right to exact revenge by killing Israelites. Instead, they presented a specific and unusual request. In verse 6, they told David, "Let 7 of his male descendants be given to us to be killed and their bodies exposed before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the Lord's chosen one." They sought justice through the execution of 7 male descendants from Saul's family. David, recognizing the gravity of the situation and the need to atone for Saul's transgression, reluctantly agreed to their request. However, he was careful to protect those who were under his personal oath and protection. Verse 7 explains, "The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the oath before the Lord between David and Jonathan, son of Saul." David had made a sacred promise to Jonathan, and he would not violate it, even to bring an end to the devastating famine. Instead, David chose 7 other descendants of Saul, 2 sons of Rizpah, Saul's concubine, and 5 grandsons through Saul's daughter Michal. The Gibeonites executed all 7 men at the beginning of the barley harvest and left their bodies exposed on the mountain. This was intended to serve as a public demonstration that justice had been served for Saul's heinous crimes. But then, something profoundly beautiful and heartbreaking occurred. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of the executed men, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock. From the beginning of the harvest until the rains came, she stayed there day and night, vigilantly protecting the bodies from being scavenged by birds and wild animals. Her unwavering and faithful vigil lasted for months, a testament to her maternal love and devotion. Verse 10 poignantly tells us that she did not let the birds touch them by day or the wild animals by night. When David learned of Rizpah's extraordinary devotion, he was deeply moved and resolved to show proper honor to the dead. He arranged for the bones of Saul and Jonathan to be brought from their burial place and gave them a dignified burial alongside the 7 executed men. Verse 14 records, "They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the tomb of Saul's father Kish at Zelah in Benjamin, and they did everything the king commanded." After that, God answered prayer in behalf of the land. As David grew older, his legendary strength began to wane, and this became dangerously apparent during yet another war with the Philistines. Chapter 21, verse 15, sets the scene. Once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. During this particular battle, David found himself facing Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, the ancient race of giants. This formidable giant warrior carried a bronze spear that weighed 300 shekels, about 7.5 pounds, and wore a brand new sword. Verse 16 tells us that he said he would kill David. The aging king was in grave danger, but his loyal warriors came to his rescue. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, struck down the giant and saved David's life. Following this close brush with death, David's men made a crucial decision. They emphatically told their king in verse 17, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished." They had come to the stark realization that David was too valuable to risk in personal combat any longer. His days as a warrior were over, but his role as king and spiritual leader would continue. The text then honors the mighty warriors who continued to fight the giants in David's place. At Gob, there was another battle with the Philistines where Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Saph, another descendant of Rapha. In yet another battle at Gob, Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's rod. The most impressive giant killer was Jonathan, son of David's brother Shimei. This particular giant possessed a remarkable physical anomaly, having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, totaling 24 digits. Verse 21 tells us that when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. The chapter concludes by noting in verse 22 that these 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. The race of giants that had terrorized Israel since the days of Moses was finally being eliminated by David's mighty warriors. Even though David could no longer fight them personally, his legacy lived on through the brave and skilled men he had trained and inspired. Near the end of his life, David composed a magnificent psalm that encapsulated God's faithfulness throughout his entire journey, from humble shepherd boy to powerful king. Chapter 22 preserves this powerful song of deliverance, which begins in verse 2 with David declaring, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. He is my stronghold, my refuge and my savior. From violent people you save me." David vividly recalled how God had rescued him from every enemy, describing his deliverance in rich and evocative imagery. In verse 5 he sang, "The waves of death swirled about me, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me, but God heard his cry for help." Verses 8 to 9 paint a dramatic picture of divine intervention. The earth trembled and quaked, the foundations of the heavens shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of it. David then praised God's perfect character, declaring in verse 26, "To the faithful, you show yourself faithful. To the blameless, you show yourself blameless." He acknowledged that his victories stemmed not from his own strength and skill, but from God's boundless power. In verse 33, David sang, "It is God who arms me with strength and keeps my way secure." The psalm concludes with David recognizing that his success would inspire people from many nations to serve the Lord. Following this soaring song of praise, David spoke his final prophetic words. Chapter 23, verse 1 introduces them. "These are the last words of David, the inspired utterance of David son of Jesse, the utterance of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, the hero of Israel's songs." These were not merely personal reflections. They were profound prophecies about the future. David spoke of a coming ruler who would be far greater than himself. In verse 3 he declared, "When one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth." David understood that his own kingdom was but a pale shadow of something far grander and more glorious that was yet to come. In verse 5, he expressed unwavering confidence in God's eternal covenant. "If my house were not right with God, surely he would not have made with me an everlasting covenant, arranged and secured in every part. Surely he would not bring to fruition my salvation and grant me my every desire." David knew that his family line would continue until the arrival of the perfect and ultimate king. Before recounting David's final sin, the text meticulously lists his mighty warriors and their heroic deeds. Chapter 23 catalogues the valiant men who had made David's kingdom possible. It begins with the three most elite fighters: Josheb-Basshebeth, who killed 800 men with his spear in a single battle; Eleazar, who fought so fiercely that his hand froze to his sword; and Shammah, who single-handedly defended a field of lentils against an entire Philistine army. The list continues with the 30 mighty men, including foreign warriors like Uriah the Hittite, whose unwavering loyalty ultimately cost him his life. After honoring these legendary heroes, the narrative takes a distinctly dark turn. Chapter 24, verse 1, tells us that, again, the narrative takes a somber turn as we delve into David's prideful act, a stark contrast to the humility he often displayed. 2 Samuel 24, verse 1 reveals, "Again the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, 'Go and take a census of Israel and Judah.'" This command wasn't rooted in strategic military planning or fiscal responsibility through taxation. Instead, it was a manifestation of David's growing hubris, a dangerous reliance on numerical strength rather than divine providence. In essence, David was counting heads instead of seeking God's face. He was placing his trust in the visible power of his kingdom, inadvertently relegating God to the background. David, succumbing to this prideful impulse, issued the order to Joab, his seasoned and often pragmatic commander. Joab, a man familiar with the realities of warfare and, perhaps, more attuned to the potential consequences of David's action, voiced his immediate disapproval. His words, recorded in verse 3, carry a tone of respectful but firm dissent. "May the Lord your God multiply the troops 100 times over, but why does my lord the king want to do such a thing?" Joab understood the inherent danger in David's request. He recognized that such a census was not an act of faith, but a dangerous exercise in self-reliance. Yet, David, blinded by his own sense of power, remained resolute. Despite Joab's cautionary words, David insisted on proceeding with the census. The undertaking was a massive logistical endeavor, requiring 9 months and 20 days to complete. The final tally revealed a formidable force: 800,000 fighting men in Israel and 500,000 in Judah, a testament to the kingdom's martial strength. But this strength, born of pride, would soon lead to devastating consequences. The moment the census was finalized, a wave of regret washed over David. The weight of his sin pressed down on him. Verse 10 poignantly captures his remorse. David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men, and he said to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. David's acknowledgement of his sin was immediate and profound. He recognized the folly of his actions and pleaded for forgiveness. However, repentance did not erase the consequences of his pride. God, in his justice and mercy, sent the prophet Gad to David, presenting him with 3 agonizing choices for punishment. 3 years of famine, 3 months of relentless pursuit by enemies, or 3 days of devastating plague. Each option carried immense suffering, forcing David to confront the gravity of his transgression. David, with a heavy heart, chose the plague. His rationale, as expressed in verse 14, reveals a profound understanding of God's character. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into human hands. He knew that even in judgment, God's mercy would prevail. He preferred to entrust himself to divine justice rather than the potentially harsher realities of human conflict. The plague unleashed its fury upon the land. In a single day, 70,000 people perished, their lives extinguished from Dan to Beersheba, a testament to the devastating power of divine judgment. As the destroying angel approached Jerusalem, David witnessed the terrifying scene. He saw the angel standing at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, a place that would soon become hallowed ground. Overwhelmed with grief and remorse, David interceded on behalf of his people, crying out in verse 17, I have sinned, and I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family. David's plea was a desperate act of self-sacrifice, a willingness to bear the full weight of God's wrath to spare his people. God, moved by David's humility and repentance, commanded him to build an altar at the very spot where the destroying angel stood. This location, the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, was destined to become the site of Solomon's temple, a place of worship and atonement. Araunah, witnessing David's distress, offered to give the threshing floor and the oxen for free. But David, recognizing the importance of sacrifice, refused the offer. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing, he declared in verse 24. David insisted on purchasing the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. He built an altar, offered sacrifices, and sought God's forgiveness. Verse 25 concludes the chapter with a message of hope and redemption. Then the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. The plague ceased and the land was healed. The place where judgment had ended would become the foundation for Solomon's temple, linking David's sin to a future of hope and reconciliation with God. This deep dive into 2 Samuel offers a profound lesson about the dangers of pride and the transformative power of repentance. If this exploration has resonated with you and opened your eyes to a new understanding of God's Word, I encourage you to take 2 simple actions. First, click that subscribe button and join our community of fellow Bible enthusiasts. We are just beginning this journey of exploring the Scriptures in ways you've never seen before, and there's so much more to discover together. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear these powerful stories. Perhaps you know a friend who finds the Bible uninspiring, or a family member grappling with issues of power, family, or faith. David's story reminds us that God often uses flawed individuals to accomplish his perfect plans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which part of David's story resonated with you the most? Was it his exuberant dance before the ark, his transgression with Bathsheba, Absalom's rebellion, or perhaps his final songs of praise? I personally read every comment and appreciate hearing how God's Word is impacting your life. Thank you for joining me on this journey through 2 Samuel. Until our next exploration, continue to delve deeper into the greatest story ever told.